Mr. Tahar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this point, I propose to take the witnesses through the issues list as all of the parties have either resolved or deferred their issues related to parking to phase 2, except for NEC. We're only going to be focusing on NEC's issues. And Mr. Dahl, let's begin with issue number 96, which relates to vehicle parking standards. And the issue from NEC is or the relevant portion is, what is the basis for the minimum and maximum rates? Mr. Dahl.
So the basis of the minimum maximum rates within the secondary plan and the zoning bylaw is the basis comes from the HDR report, the recommendations coming from that report. It's to, I guess from a high level, allow developers to provide enough parking for their sites to function on a site-by-site basis while allowing some flexibility within the design. I think my colleague was clear in his witness statement and his testimony as to how they derived at those rates. And we'd like to note that they were reduced from the 2017 rates that were in that secondary plan and bylaw.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. And I'm not going to go to the remainder of the issue because I think it repeats in other issues, and so we will get there later on. Issue number 97, NEC's issue number 44. Should provision be made for small or compact car spaces? Mr. Dahl.
So currently, the city does not have a policy on smaller compact car spaces. The appropriateness of such spaces within the context of City of Richmond Hill are currently under review as part of the ongoing 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new developments projects. At this time, it would be premature to apply a compact car requirement for the entire KDA until that study has been completed to identify the appropriateness of those spaces within Richmond Hill.
Thank you. Turning to NEC issue number 3, issue number 66 on the redacted list. Do the secondary plan and zoning bylaw conform with the requirements for a secondary plan, KDA, and transportation and parking policies of the York Region official plan? Mr. Dahl.
Excuse me. In general, the secondary plan section 12.4.3, which is tab 33, aligns and expands on the York Region official plan, which is tab 6. So it aligns and expands with the policies within that document. In the sense that the parking rates are less than the rest of Richmond Hill, it's less than the rest of Richmond Hill, consistent with the 2010 parking strategy for the city, and then further reduced as part of the development of the secondary plan and zoning bylaw. Specifically, and these are just a couple of section references. Secondary plan section 12.4.3 subparagraph 5.0, that's referring to the inclusion of maximum parking rates as a TDM measure, conforms with York Region official plan section 5.4.8.a, which says to include that. Secondary plan section 12.4.3 subparagraph 6b, which is the inclusion of shared parking rates between uses, aligns with York Region OP section 5.4.8b. Zoning bylaw section 5.16, which provides some details regarding the location of parking areas behind or beside buildings, conforms with the York Region OP policy 5.4.8c. Zoning bylaw section 5.15 through 5.17 which deals with details regarding the vehicle parking areas and structures, conforms with York OP policy 5.48D in the sense that these policies encourage the evolution of parking areas from their existing conditions, which are primarily surface parking, to a more structured format. And finally, secondary plan 12.43 subparagraph 1 pertaining to car share, subparagraph 5K pertaining to preferential carpool parking, and subparagraph 6A, once again dealing with car share, aligned with York official plan section 5.4.8E.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. I'm now going to issue number 69 and issue number 76 together. They're both issues raised by NEC. They're components of those issues that I believe relate to parking that question the use or the promotion of zero-car households in issue 69, and as it relates to issue 76, question zero-car household dwelling units or non-automobile households. My question to you is, what is your opinion on zero-car households, non-automobile households, and zero-car household dwelling units?
So the city is currently under the process of developing an affordable housing strategy. I guess, goals of that strategy are to develop a made in Richmond Hill housing strategy in order to identify what the city can do to provide housing that is affordable to moderate income households in the city, and to provide a framework for the city to deliver this housing through partnerships and other means. But currently that study is not complete, and so the city does not currently have a policy on rent geared to income properties, which is the more general term for affordable housing. It includes affordable housing, cooperative housing, subsidized housing, and whatnot. There's nuances in the description of affordable housing, which is why it's important for that policy to exist prior to transportation developing specific parking rates for those particular units. Because depending on the organizational structure of that affordable housing, targeted demographics, whether there's any sort of assisted living components of those affordable housing or otherwise quasi-medical uses incorporated into them, those all kind of impact the operation of those potential facilities. And therefore, at this time, it'd be premature to comment on the appropriateness of parking requirements for these properties, given that that's unknown. Nevertheless, through the proposed parking rates for apartment dwellings contained within the secondary plan, specifically table 5.1.3.1, which is just the table of the parking requirements. I would note that the parking rates for residential dwellings range from 0.7 to 1. And so in an essence, if you were to apply those parking rates to a development, assuming that it wasn't consisting solely of 3-bedroom units, you would result in an average number of less than 1 unit of parking stall per unit. Say, for example, if you were to propose a development with 25% bachelor, 40% 1-bedroom, 30% 2-bedroom, and 5% 3-bedroom, you would end up with an aggregate parking rate of 0.815 approximately, which would mean that 18.5% of that development would be without a parking space. Bundled with an item within our TDM strategy as per secondary plan section 12.4.3, we included a bullet there giving the option to unbundle parking supply from parking agreements, which is to say that depending on the structure of that development, whether it be rental where the organization operating the building holds on to the parking supply and then leases it to tenants as needed, or if you move to an arrangement where the purchase of a unit and the purchase of a parking space are separate, you have opportunities where some units would be without parking just naturally through these parking rates, which are developed for a key development area. And so there's opportunities already within the existing framework laid forward for this secondary plan area to develop, in a sense, households without parking.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dahl. I'm going to now turn to issue number 79 and 81 collectively. They're both issues raised by NEC. Issue number 79 questions or raises issues with the active transportation policy, section 12.4.1, and the related schedules. Issue 81 raises issue with section 12.4.3, including subpart 5 and 6. Can you please provide me your opinions on the sub-issues raised in 79 and 81? Mr.
Sure. And so these are mostly pertaining to these are entirely pertaining to transportation demand management elements and bicycle parking tangentially to that. So the bicycle space requirements were developed from HDR through their best practices study, and so those were carried forward. The intent of section 12.4.3 within the secondary plan, which once again is that transportation demand management section with the list of items, that was like purposefully provided as a broad toolbox in order to help achieve the goals set out within that section of the secondary plan, i.e. to reduce the amount of travel by decreasing the need to travel by car, shifting travel away from single argument vehicle, and those all the reasons I went through this morning already. It's intentionally long in order to incorporate innovative use of those TDM measures within proposed developments in order to help achieve those goals. We felt that, once again, going overly prescriptive with requirements of a smaller subset of those TDM measures may have been a barrier to development depending on the site-specific context of that development. And to reiterate, all of the items contained within that list and including the parking rates in general will be further evaluated and continue to be refined as part of that ongoing 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new developments project. The items listed within subparagraph 6 of that section, which once again are those car share and shared parking references, are consistent with current practices, i.e. they're consistent with the 2010 strategy and how development review is done at the city at this time. Specifically, the shared parking consideration was simplified, focusing on employment and residential. The car share consideration was also brought forward from the 2010 parking strategy, and both of those items will also be continued to be evaluated and refined as part of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new development projects. Maximum and minimum parking rates were included in both the bylaw, and also the philosophy of having maximum parking rates are included within the secondary plan, because the existence of a maximum parking rate in and of itself is a way of managing transportation demand. In my professional opinion, the approach outlined within the secondary and zoning bylaw conforms with provincial, regional, and city policies from a parking and TDM perspective, enabling thoughtful site design and initiatives through TDM to inform the parking supply.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. Turning to issue number 85, which is also NEC's issue. Section 12.4.8, just what is the city's current parking strategy? Are the proposed policies supportive of active transportation, transit, and housing affordability goals for the KDA and Yonge Street corridor? If not, what modifications are required? Mr. Dahl, if you could address that.
Right. So once again, the 2010 parking strategy is the currently used parking strategy at the city. However, what is proposed within the Yonge and Bernard KDA is an evolution of that strategy in the sense that it took the early preliminary findings of the 2020 version of that strategy into account when it developed reduced parking rates and the extended list of TDM measures within the secondary plan. Nonetheless, the 2010 parking strategy, the existing strategy, is supportive of the goals within the Yonge and Bernard secondary plan to shift away from focus of automobile use towards the creation of transit, cycling, and pedestrian-oriented destinations. Specifically, and I'll give a high-level example from that 2010 parking strategy, which is what the topic of this issue is. So section 4.2.1 of that 2010 parking strategy notes the following in regards to how it derived parking rates for KDA at the time of its writing. The approach for the recommended parking standards in downtown local centers and key development areas is to reduce parking by 20 to 30% compared to current parking requirements at the time of its writing. This approach is based on research by the Victoria Transport Policy Institute and a comparison of downtown to non-downtown parking standards in other municipalities. Further to that, the recommendations within section 4.2.1 of that 2010 parking strategy introduced maximum parking rates to Richmond Hill, stating that maximum parking supply rates of approximately 25% above the recommended minimum are intended to reduce parking availability and provide further support for the vision of a pedestrian and transit-focused downtown. The parking rates illustrated in this section are generally less than other parts of Richmond Hill or the rest of Richmond Hill, as is noted in that report. And this supported the goals for the KDA and Yonge Street corridor. Prior to this recommendation in 2010, there were no maximums. And so this report had introduced them. Section 4.2.1 continues in 4.2.1 of that 2010 parking strategy recommends that policies in support of transportation demand management, transit uses, active transportation, and carpooling should be implemented. And so the ongoing 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new developments projects are intended to expand on this recommendation and create clear guidance and requirements for applying TDM measures to new development. And so again, the 2020 study is intended to act on that 2010 recommendation as part of the update.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. I believe we've gone through all of NEC's issues related to parking that are not deferred to phase 2. And with that, and given that no other party is raising issues with parking, I'd ask you to provide your recommendations and your overall conclusions to the tribunal, Mr. Dahl, and then followed by Mr. Shaw.
So for these reasons, as well as those set out within my witness statement dated June 23rd, it remains my professional opinion that the Yonge and Bernard secondary plan and KDA zoning bylaw with the proposed modifications that have been recommended by city staff and endorsed by city council, as well as any further modifications that are now proposed by the city witnesses are appropriate and conform to and consent with applicable provincial, regional, and city plans and policies and constitute good transportation planning from a parking and TDM perspective. In particular, it remains my professional opinion that the minimum parking rates as proposed by the city and KDA zoning bylaw are appropriate and supportable from a policy standpoint. Yeah.
And Mr. Chai?
So in conclusion, in summary, based on the evidence that you've heard today, it is my professional opinion that the recommendations set forth by the city and by the HDR report are reasonable and represent good planning with respect to consistent parking rates with peer municipalities in similar growth areas within York Region. And further, that these recommendations will guide development in the Yonge Bernard KDA, but also allow for flexibility and allow for site-specific applications to come forward and provide plans which support further parking reductions and support transit active transportation and sustainability in alignment with provincial, regional, and city policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chai. Mr. Chair, no further questions for this panel.
This comes the time I gather that the pause.
Mr. Chair, I understand there are a number of parties who might have some short friendly cross. It might be appropriate to do that first before we break.
Okay. Next. Pardon me. Anybody out there?
Sir, it's Mr. Kagan. Usually I go after the region. I don't know whether the region has any questions though.
I don't have any questions, so you can go ahead, Ira.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be very quick, sir. I've got very few questions. And this question is to the panel generally. So both of you can answer the question because they're general in nature. Are you aware that in this case, NEC represented by Mr. Streisfield is the only party in this hearing, the only landowner, including the residents, even the residents aren't challenging. They're the only party in this hearing challenging the parking rates that have been recommended by the city and supported by everybody else. Were you aware of that when you gave your evidence?
Yes.
And Mr. Chai?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Are you also aware that NEC has consistently resisted scoping their parking concerns to the NEC lands alone? And allow me to explain what I mean by that question. That what NEC wants to do is they want to impose its own preferred parking standard on all the other lands in the KDA, even when those other owners don't want that to happen. Were you aware of that when you gave your evidence?
It's been my understanding that NEC has been the only landowner providing issue to the parking, and yes, it's been my understanding that generally there's been a lot of resistance in trying to reach a consensus on the parking matters or issues prior to the hearing.
Mr. Dahl, my question was a little different than that, so I'm sorry if it was a long one and I didn't get to the point quickly. I wanted to know if you were aware that the NEC position isn't just that they don't like the parking standard, but that they want their own preferred parking standard to apply to everybody. In other words, they're not satisfied if their own preferred parking standard applies to their own development. They wanted to apply to all developments. And I just wanted to know whether when you gave your evidence, you were aware of that.
Yes, I was aware that what they were proposing was intended to apply everywhere in the KDA.
And Mr. Chai?
Yes, I was aware.
All right, so those were setup questions to the next couple, which are sort of the more important ones. I had to establish a base. In your collective experience, have you seen this happen before? And if so, is it common or is it unusual?
Let's see.
Can you not hear me anymore, sir?
Yes. Hang on.
Sorry.
Mr. Streisfield. Mr. Streisfield has objected to the question.
Oh, I can't hear Mr. Streisfield.
Neither
Sorry
can
about
we.
that.
Neither can we.
I'm trying to unmute myself.
Ah, you're unmuted now.
Oh. So the objection is that what he is aware of is not the basis or a proper question for his expert opinion. That's my objection.
Well, those
Things
questions
that-
were already asked and answered. I've moved on to another question.
Things that he is aware of, I just want to establish the ground rules, because I'll be asking, if we proceed, on lots of things that people are aware of, and then we're going to be seeing where we go with what they're aware of. But we'll hear his answer.
No, I've received the answer to the two questions of what they were aware of. I was on to question number 3,
Yes.
which was, given what you were aware of, in your experience, have you seen this happen before? And if you have, is it a common occurrence or is it unusual?
Hold. And so my objection is, what is it that he is asking the witness that he's seen before? What is it?
Those were the
The
answers he gave to the
That's
first two
answers he
questions.
gave for the first two questions about
It was
the
pretty clear.
position of NEC. And he's asking, is the witness aware of similar circumstances?
And my objection is, how is that the subject matter of expert opinion?
Would you like me to answer the
I'm not
objection?
sure he's asking for expert opinion. He's just asking for, is he aware of any sort of similar circumstance? Go.
Mr. Dahl, do you want to try to answer first?
Sure. Based on my experience, I am not aware of this. I'm not aware of site-specific parking rates being pursued as part of a hearing in this manner. From my experience, I've seen these parking rates pursued as part of a specific development application.
In
Mr.
my
Chai?
experience, sorry, in my experience, same answer. I have not seen site-specific applications seek to guide the parking rates across an entire area.
All right, and that's a very good segue then, sirs, to my last question. So I need you to make an assumption. I need you to accept an assumption for the purpose of my question. Assume that NEC has long-term leases with first-class tenants like McDonald's and Tim Hortons. I can't tell you exactly the number of years, but just assume those users are not leaving anytime soon. And assume that therefore that means that high-density residential development on at least part of the NEC lands might be more delayed than compared, for example, to the Doliola lands. Those high-density lands are vacant, or the Yonge MCD lands, likewise. So with that assumption in mind, what is your opinion on whether or not the secondary plan being asked to be approved would permit NEC to seek a lower parking standard as part of a site-specific application it could file in the future? Does the secondary plan permit that?
The secondary plan would not preclude the ability of NEC to develop their site. The specifics of lease agreements are quite frankly not something that we look into as part of a development application review, nor concerned with. That's part of developing the secondary plan. Yeah.
Mr. Chai?
In my professional opinion, as stated in my evidence, the guiding policies of the secondary plan, I feel are, in my opinion again, are appropriate to guide the development of the secondary plan, irrespective of any assumptions about any specific owners. And that when any specific owners come in for a site plan application, that it would be appropriate at that time to seek any possible changes to the guidance provided in the secondary plan. That's my opinion.
All right, so Mr. Dahl, one more question for you, because I think I asked my question poorly, which is why I probably didn't get the answer I was hoping for. So I'm going to try one more time with you. Is there anything in the approval of this secondary plan which would preclude NEC from filing site-specific applications in the future minor variances, rezoning, whatever is appropriate, to have a different lower parking standard apply for its site if warranted?
No, there's no barrier for them to develop their site in the future based on the way that the secondary plan and bylaw is currently written. In fact, transportation demand management strategy as part of the secondary plan is specifically there as a mechanism to pursue lower parking rates in the future.
So, Mr. Chairman, those are my questions. I think if the region had asked a couple of questions, I would have had time to phrase my last question better. As you could see, I did the best I could, but I should have asked a better question at the end.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chair, Young MCD does not have any questions for the parking panel.
Anyone?
Mr. Chair, TSMJC does not have any questions for the parking panel.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chair, I had not anticipated asking any questions. I do have 7 questions written out that I think will be faster than Mr. Kagan.
Okay.
Thank you. So this is for the panel. You can decide who answers. Why was the weather protection? So one of the TDM measures is weather protection adjacent to transit stops. In the 2017 plan, this was a requirement. In the 2020 version, it is optional. Can you explain why that change was made?
Let me just.
Mr. Chair, I'm a bit confused by this because while I appreciate that Mr. Cherniak is attempting to cross-examine the parking panel, he's in fact not raised any issues on the issues list regarding parking.
So this is a TDM measure that has an effect on use of transit. That's why I'm raising it.
Okay, maybe I need to hear the question.
Okay. Again.
In the 2017 secondary plan, weather protection adjacent to transit stops, so basically making it easier for people to get to transit stops in the cold or the rain, was a requirement. In the 2020 plan, it is now optional. I'm asking why that change was made.
I'm just pulling up the relevant section for my own purposes. Please bear with me. Do you have, to help me find it, do you have the specific line item?
It's in the list of TDM measures.
Mm-hmm.
You had gone to it in your evidence, so I didn't think to pull it up.
Are you specifically referencing weather protection along street frontages adjacent to transit stops?
Yes, exactly.
So I believe it's a bit of a cross-disciplinary question, to be honest. It may be more appropriate for the urban design team to respond to something like that because it deals with streetscaping. However, we still incorporate it as part of the TDM strategy in general in order to try to facilitate that. And this is just my outside opinion as to why this may have gone from should be considered to a may be considered. And it may have to do with the fact that some quadrants may have less opportunities to provide that weather protection specifically adjacent to transit stops because of the center runway along Yonge Street. That would have been the major change from 2017 to now. A development wouldn't be able to provide that streetscape in the middle of the regional right-of-way, for example. And so it may just be that it's like less applicable, but still a consideration. But again, I would recommend bringing that up with the urban design team.
Okay, and maybe I'll ask Mr. Chai this. Would you agree that the sort of weather protection that we're talking about would lead to less cars being used overall?
Yeah, so generally speaking, in my opinion, that additional comfort for transit users would be beneficial to transit users. I can't comment on the specific question about it being required previously and why it's now presented as optional. Just generally speaking, the site-specific reasons that Jason mentioned and the context related to each site does vary, and I do agree with that statement, and that may be the reason why it appears in this way. Further, I would add that a comprehensive consultation on the TDM measures has not yet been completed as part of the 2020 study, which we do intend to do. So I do believe that there may be further opportunity to refine how we develop the recommendations of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy to address issues such as the one that you've raised, Mr. Trenier.
Thank you. And I have a similar question. Subsidized transit passes were initially required and now they're only optional. Can you explain why that change was made and what its effect would be on the use of cars?
So that change was made because as part of development applications at the regional level, transit passes are required for them as part of the development charges. And so, that requirement would still hold at the regional level, irrespective of the city's requirements for a TDM strategy. This instance, in this case, is merely just if a developer were to choose to subsidize passes beyond that regional requirement, that would also be considered as a TDM measure. So I guess that would be a further subsidization of transit passes beyond the regional TDM requirements.
Okay, and I have what I think are 3 questions that relate to density overall. When you look at the changes that are going to be made, the office and commercial use is going to increase. And I understand there are issues with underground parking at the site. How can you be sure that there's going to be enough parking for these new office and commercial uses?
With respect to the guiding policies of the secondary plan that we have recommended through the HDR report, it is based initially on a best practices review, which has looked at the policies of similar jurisdictions in York Region that are in force or in effect in the bylaws of other municipalities. And we've undertaken that review in comparison to the city's pre-existing 2010 parking strategy. We feel that on that basis, the recommended parking rates for, I think you mentioned non-residential uses generally, are appropriate. But we do recognize that further data collection is going to be undertaken as part of our study when time allows and as demand increases as the pandemic slows down, hopefully.
And are you able to advise on is there a total decrease in the number of spaces available for commercial or non-residential uses from this new plan compared to today, and how large a decrease it is?
With respect to the size of the decrease, I can't comment on that specifically. I'd have to do some calculations perhaps, because the 2010 strategy provided a pretty specific breakdown. Like I think one of the big ones was medical offices in particular, and the demand for parking for those offices, as seen in other jurisdictions, is lower than what was initially shown or identified in the 2010 parking strategy. So that's one example of a more significant reduction off the top of my head. But just in general, like overall, we do anticipate the need for less parking for non-residential uses, and I can't comment specifically on that, on a percentage at this point in time.
And if there aren't, this is the last question, if there aren't enough parking spaces, would you expect cars to end up parked on the local residential roads and that sort of thing?
So with respect to cars ending up on local roads, that would be, obviously it would be a concern to residents. We would not want that to happen. But with all I can say as from my position is that the rates that we're recommending are in line with other jurisdictions in York Region. So I think from my perspective, that's the appropriateness of our recommendation.
I would also add that as a transportation demand management strategy, specifically through the regional requirements, they also identify monitoring as part of a TDM strategy, where once a development is built and fully occupied, things such as parking utilization, which is the amount of parking spaces occupied versus supply provided, are monitored at the date of full occupancy, and then in some cases it would be an amount of time after occupancy, either 6 months or 2 years, or some interval of time where you may see a certain amount of changeover of demographics or leases or tenants or what have you. And you can monitor what that utilization is on either a site-by-site basis or a KDA basis. And so I guess through the development of this key development area over time, you could monitor the use of off-street and on-street parking in order to identify these issues before they become problematic to the existing neighborhoods.
Is that monitoring one of the policies in the secondary plan?
I would have to double check it, but like I said, it is a requirement as part of the regional, for a site-specific development application process. It is a requirement, and historically it is something that Richmond Hill regularly collects securities for as part of our ongoing application process. And that's part of our existing process where we do collect for those monitoring surveys.
Okay, so I would suggest either it's there or it's not. I'm prepared to just take an answer in writing, and I'll use it if I need to in closing submissions, if that's fair for everybody. Or it can be given to us after the break. I won't have any follow-up questions.
Well, actually in section 12.5.2, labeled monitoring, it does show subsection E, travel characteristics, modal split, and implementation of TDM measures. I would consider, since TDM measures are a component of reduced parking rates, that it would be captured within that policy. But noted that it doesn't specifically note parking.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Anyone else? So Mr. Kushner, we're off to some time, are we?
We are, Mr. Chair, although I note the hour, and I might suggest that perhaps we just take our lunch break now rather than taking the extended break that Mr. Streisfield had asked for earlier.
Well, do you want an hour as against 45 minutes then?
I think that
you can work it all in, maybe?
Sure.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you.
So, well, let's say 1:30.
Thank you.